Hello guys, this is Nick from nickmavromatisproductions, and today I'm gonna be showing you how to mix huge snare for contemporary music. This song is a rock metal song, but those tips can really be used in any genre where you wanna have huge snare. And on this tutorial, what I'm gonna be showing you is how to EQ, compress, saturate, layer the snare. Then I'm gonna be showing you some room mic tips, reverb tricks, and also how to use buses to make that huge sounding snare. Alright, let's dive into it. There's a lot that we need to say for this tutorial. Let's take a look at what we have here. So alright, so this is the type of the song that we're gonna be mixing today. This is a song by my band October and it's called Devil's Den. So let's see what I've done to the snare. I'm gonna solo the drums. So this is what the drums sound like soloed. For these, now I'm gonna solo the snare with nothing on it. I'm gonna bypass all the plugins and the buses as well, and I'm gonna solo the snare and playback. So this is what the snare sounds like without any plugins on. So the first thing I like to do on a snare, as I do with every drum sample, is saturate it. And saturation gives a more analog feel to everything you put it on. So yeah, let's see what I've done here. So I'm using the Slate Digital old bundle. This is the virtual mix rack, and this particular plugin is called FG73. It's this plugin here. It's just two knobs. This is all that it is. Then the second plugin I'm using is a VCC channel. So this is supposed to emulate the saturation that a console gives. I mean, this one is supposed to give you the color of the preamp, and then this is supposed to give you the color of the console, which is a very different type of saturation. So this is why I use both of those plugins. And then what I'm using is an equalizer, the custom series equalizer, CSEQ, and I'm only boosting the top end at 10K. That's all I do with this one here. Second plugin I have on is a tape emulator. This is very classic. So all these plugins together make the snare sound thicker, heavier, richer without it even being EQ'd or compressed. So let's do a bypass, a non-bypass. So this is without the saturation. And with. The difference is not massive, but it is there. It makes the sound better. It makes it more analog. From what I can tell, it removes some harshness and replaces it with a little bit of nicer color, which I love. Then second type of plugin that I'm using is a Transient designer. A Transient designer, as the plugin says, it changes the transients of the sound, meaning the attack and the sustain or the decay of the sound. So ignore everything you see about this plugin here. This is supposed to be a console channel emulation. I'm only using those two knobs right here, sustain and punch. So the punch would add literally more attack to your snare, and then sustain would add more decay to your snare. So let's do before and after. So this is without, and this is with. Without and with. So again, this makes the sound of a snare thicker, tighter, punchier. So again, I haven't compressed or EQ'd the snare yet, and it already sounds better than it did before. So now let's go to the next plugin, which is an equalizer. I'm only using this equalizer to roll off the high end from 15k and above. And what is really nice about this plugin is that it emulates a tube equalizer. So a tube equalizer has tubes in it, as you can tell. So those tubes, what those tubes do is they saturate the sound even more. This equalizer gives a really nice, rich and thick tube saturation. So far I'm using 4 different types of saturation on my snare alone. So I'm using the preamp saturation, the console saturation, the tape saturation, and now I'm using an equalizer with tube saturation on it. So the difference with the tube saturation is that it produces the sweetest possible harmonics to the audio source that you put it on. So what that means is that it actually reproduces even harmonics, while other types of saturation reproduce more what we call odd harmonics. So even harmonics means that the harmonics that are reproduced are like octaves, or maybe fifths or fourths, which are the most pleasant intervals in music. So when we say like an equalizer that is very musical, this is exactly the definition of it. When we use a tube equalizer, the tubes reproduce even harmonics to the sound, and that makes the sound so nice. So that's the 4th plugin that I'm using, and then the 5th plugin is again an equalizer, which I am only using this equalizer because this is another type of tube equalizer, but this one is called passive equalizer. So the difference with the previous plugin is that this plugin uses the tubes of a power amp, while this plugin uses the tubes of a preamp. So you see here the tubes that I'm using on this plugin are the 12AX7 that you can literally find on a guitar amp, and then on this plugin I'm using the EL34s, which again are tubes that you can actually find on a guitar amp again, but you will find those tubes on the last section of a guitar amp, which is the power amp. So different types of saturation. So we're counting 5 different types of saturation up to now. So let's see what our snare sounds with and without those 2 plugins. Without. And with. Again, the difference is very subtle, but all these things together start building up a very analog, a very fat sounding snare. I know that I'm talking a lot, so if at any point you have any questions, please comment below. Ask me if there's something that you don't understand. Ask me if there's something on a matter that you want more info, or if there's something from the techniques that I'm using maybe that you want to learn more about. You can suggest me to do a tutorial about that as well. So anyway, let's continue. So now let's go to the more interesting stuff, which is EQing the snare. So I'm using 2 equalizers so far, but I haven't EQ'd the snare at all, only rolling off some frequencies above 15k. So now I'm using this snare, I'm using this equalizer to only subtract frequencies. So this type of equalizing that I'm using is a technique called subtractive EQing. I only subtract frequencies from the snare. I'm not adding any frequencies. So the way that I'm using subtractive EQing is by just rolling off the frequencies that I don't like, which actually give space to the frequencies that I like to shine more and be more apparent in the mix. So for example, there's some nods here that I didn't like, 1, 2, 3 nods, and then there's some 3 general areas on which I treated with some more wide cue that I didn't like. So let's take a listen to with and without the equalizer. So this is without. And with. So what I did is I removed all the unpleasant frequencies, which gives more space to the frequencies that I like to get in the front of the mix. This is a technique that I've seen from Nolly Adam Getgood from Periphery. I'm pretty sure that he mentioned that he saw this technique from someone else, but I saw it from Nolly. But anyway, thanks Nolly for the awesome info. Like literally, subtractive EQing literally changed my life, my mixing life, and the way I EQ everything. So yeah, subtractive EQing is a technique that I suggest you take a deeper look into and try to get a better understanding of it. This would require a different tutorial, I guess. So let's move on to compression, our favorite thing for the snare. So I really suggest that you take a good thinking on what compressor you're going to use, because every type of compressor has a different type of sound that gives to your audio. Different types of compressors give you different results. So the compressor of my choice is this PG FET compressor, which is amazing. I love it. So let's see what the snare sounds without and with this compressor. And this is with. Alright, so as you can tell, I haven't compressed the snare too much. And how did I do that? So you see here that mix knob here, it's turned down to only 25%. If I turn it all the way up to 100%, it would sound like this. And I know you think that by itself it sounds great, but sometimes less is more, and compression couldn't be a greater example of this. You think that by compressing the shit out of a snare, it's gonna make it sound better. But what it does is it makes some but what happens if you over compress the snare or any other sound? What happens is that you accentuate certain elements and certain transients of the sound that you're putting the compressor on. So it might be sounding good by itself, but when you put this sound into a whole mix, then you realize that the compressor takes out of some things, because you can hear too loud some of the elements of the snare, and then you cannot hear very loud some other elements of the snare. So my advice on compressing is less is more. So the settings that I did are really important, and the attack, the slow attack, this is the slowest setting possible on this compressor. This is a really fast compressor and really aggressive compressor, so this is the slowest setting on the attack I could set. This is 30 milliseconds, allows the attack of the snare to go through the compressor without it being compressed. This is what it does. So the attack of the snare, the punch, is not compressed because we want all the attack we can get from the snare. And then the release is set to a pretty fast setting, I guess, 122 milliseconds. So yeah, these are the settings that I've done on this compressor. And also I'm driving the input a lot on this compressor because this compressor also gives a little bit of color as well to the snare. So let's go to the next compressor that I'm using, which is a really interesting plugin and a really nice plugin. I love this compressor. So this is another tube compressor, PG tube compressor, and you can see all those different elements here on the top of it. All those elements here, the transformers, the output stage tubes, the capacitor, and the input stage tube, all this give a different color to your sound. So I'm getting again a little bit more of saturation from this compressor besides the compression that I'm getting from it. And the most important thing here is that mix knob. Again, I'm only using it at 29%. So yeah, these are the settings of this compressor as well. Let's see what it sounds with and without. I'll put the mix knob at 100% for you to be able to hear the nice saturation that I'm talking about. I'm gonna bypass it again. Unbypassed. So what it does, I love this plugin so much. So what it does, it gives the snare a little bit of clarity, it gives it a little bit of high end, which is not like EQing the snare. This is like a lot different than EQing the snare. It gives a high end by saturating it rather than boosting all the frequencies like an equalizer would do. Besides the top end, it also removes some mids, some harshness, some really ugly frequencies that I don't like, and it also makes the sound richer and thicker even more. So yeah, this is all I'm doing for my snare. So mostly I'm not using this plugin in order to compress the snare that much, rather than again saturate it. So as you can tell, I am saturating the snare loads. But the thing is that, as I said, sometimes less is more. So do not overdo it with saturation. I mean, you can use loads of different types of saturations, but do not overuse them, do not overdrive them, because then it's gonna have the opposite result. It's gonna make the snare distorted and ugly. So this is all I'm doing on the channel of the snare.